There are some people in life who just seem to have it all figured out. They're the ones who rise above everyone else, the ones everyone looks up to. They're leaders, visionaries, almost like they have this magic touch. Bernie Madoff was one of those people. He wasn't just any trader, he was the trader. Wall Street practically revolved around him. For years, Madoff's track record was flawless. If you wanted to invest, you didn't just give your money to anyone. You had to know someone who could vouch for you, someone who could say, yeah, you're good enough to be in this exclusive club. Getting Madoff to manage your money was like getting a golden ticket. His returns were so consistent, so perfect, it almost felt like he had cracked the code to making money. But Madoff wasn't just a trader. He was a force. He became chairman of the Nasdaq, helped shape the way trading worked, and built a financial empire worth billions. For decades, it looked like nothing could stop him. His name was synonymous with success. But, as you probably know, all that glitters are not always gold. Everything came crashing down. In 2008, the truth came out, and the world was stunned. Bernie Madoff, the man everyone thought was untouchable, had been running the largest Ponzi scheme the world had ever seen, $65 billion worth of lies. A decade of building his empire turned out to be built on nothing but deceit. The man who had it all ended up losing everything. Let's rewind to 1960. Bernie Madoff, a young man with big dreams, starts his investment firm with just $5,000, about $50,000 in today's money. Where did this money come from? Well, Bernie wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth. He made that money working summer jobs as a lifeguard and a sprinkler installer. Then, on top of that, his father-in-law chipped in another $50,000. Altogether, that's roughly $580,000 in today's dollars. And with that, Bernie Madoff was ready to step into the world of high finance, but Bernie knew he had to do something to stand out. He had to find a way to compete with the big, established investment firms, and that's when he turned to something innovative, technology. In the early days of his firm, Madoff embraced electronic trading, a concept that was almost unheard of at the time. While the rest of Wall Street relied on the traditional methods of human traders shouting orders and waving their hands, Madoff's firm was at the forefront of a technological revolution. His firm didn't just use technology, they pioneered it. And this tech-savvy approach allowed them to offer lower-cost services, attracting more clients and securing a bigger share of the market. In fact, it's believed that at one point, between 5% to 10% of all stock trades in New York went through Madoff's firm. Fast forward to 1971, the Nasdaq was born, the first ever electronic stock exchange. This was a game changer in the financial world, and Madoff, it came with a wave of new innovations in electronic trading. Today, the Nasdaq is the second largest stock exchange in the world. It's where companies like Tesla, Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook, even other bigger and smaller companies choose to trade their shares. By the early 90s, Bernie Madoff was so deeply embedded in the financial world that he became the chairman of Nasdaq, a prestigious position that placed him among the elite of Wall Street. But as Wall Street was caught up in the mystic of Madoff, no one knew that behind the walls of Madoff empire something else was happening. Well, almost no one knew. It wasn't until a man named Harry Markopolos stepped onto the scene that the world would start to learn the truth. Markopolos was a financial fraud investigator, and back in the late 90s, he was working as a portfolio manager at a firm called Rampart Investment Management. One day, his firm noticed something odd. One of their partner hedge funds was posting returns that seemed too good to be true. A consistent 1 to 2% profit every single month. This turned out to be the work of none other than Bernie Madoff. Harry Markopolos was subsequently given the task of replicating Madoff's strategy at his own firm Rampart. As Harry began reverse engineering the strategy, he had no idea that he had just stumbled across the biggest financial scam Wall Street had ever seen. According to Harry, it took him 5 minutes of looking at Madoff's revenue stream to realize that things just didn't add up. Madoff's returns were too consistent. When the market went up, Madoff made a profit, and when the market went down, Madoff still made a profit. Harry Markopolos was adamant that Madoff's returns weren't real. The returns seemed to be unfazed by the market conditions. There was little to no fluctuation despite the market movements. Harry had two theories: either Madoff was trading on insider information, or this was all a giant Ponzi scheme. Now, before we dive deeper, let's take a moment to understand what a Ponzi scheme actually is. At its core, it's a fraud where new investors' money is used to pay returns to earlier investors. It's a shell game, a balancing act that relies on a constant influx of new money to sustain the illusion of profitability. But the moment the money stops flowing in, the whole house of cards comes crashing down. A Ponzi scheme being a pretty simple concept. Investors would give Madoff their money depending on the amount to invest, and Madoff gives them some healthy return. The return doesn't come from actual investments. He simply gives back a small portion of their initial investment and calls that a return. Eventually the money dries up, so the stock needs to be replenished. Madoff then moves on to the next investor, and so the scam grows larger. On paper, the investor has money invested in Madoff's firm and gets a good return. In reality, the money is being siphoned into Madoff's own accounts, as well as paying off old investors to keep the lie afloat. It almost seems too ridiculous to believe. How could this have happened on such a scale under the noses of some of the greatest financial minds in the world? But that was the talent of Madoff. He knew how to lie and how to be convincing of it, and besides, who would dare question the man who helped build the modern Wall Street? As Harry began further breaking down Madoff's strategy, he immediately ran into mathematical inconsistencies. For example, he calculated that in order for Madoff's strategy to work, he would have to abort more options on the Chicago Board of Options Exchange than actually existed. In addition, he couldn't find a single transaction by Madoff firms on the exchange. Harry spoke with a dozen equity firms, but none of them had made any trades that Madoff. And this was strange. In reality, Madoff hadn't made a single trade since 1993, or perhaps even earlier. In 2000, Harry took his findings to the Securities and Exchange Commission, otherwise all known as the SEC, but Harry didn't have any hard evidence against Madoff. It was just a theory and some red flags. Therefore, an investigation wasn't opened. But Harry wasn't the only one who was suspicious over Madoff. When asked about it several years later, he confirmed that hundreds of people within Wall Street had been suspicious, but when asked why none of them ever reported anything, he responded, quote, "People in glass houses don't throw stones." By 2005, Marco Polo's had uncovered many more red flags surrounding Madoff, and the SEC eventually opened an investigation in 2006. But Madoff had ties with the SEC, and on occasion was even called to provide advice. Madoff also knew how to get around the auditor's testimony from former staff. Describe how they cooled down falsified documents in the fridge so that auditors wouldn't notice that there had been freshly printed. The investigation was closed 11 months later due to a lack of evidence, and soon after, Madoff audaciously praised the SEC. Same quote: "In today's regulatory environment, it's virtually impossible to violate the rules." Many people couldn't believe his crimes had gone unnoticed for this long, and that astonishment, it turned to anger when it was revealed that one man uncovered the Ponzi scheme, even went to the Securities and Exchange Commission 5 times to try and expose it. "He was stealing my clients, and I wasn't going to tolerate that. If you steal from a Greek, we come after." The stakes were so high that he bought a gun and routinely would check his car for bombs. I realized then that Madoff was stealing from several people from different countries, and if he was doing that, that was a very dangerous game for him to play, because if they found out, they were going to kill him. But Madoff at this time must have known that it was only a matter of time before the hypocrisy in his words would be revealed. Ironically, in the end, it wasn't anything that the SEC or Harry Markopolos did that caught Madoff out. Greater forces came into play. It was December 2008, and Wall Street was bathed in a sea of red. Stocks were crashing, and panic spread like wildfire. The Nasdaq had taken a massive hit, and everything seemed to be spiraling out of control. The Dow was down more than 550 points, a loss that left traders staring in disbelief, struggling to comprehend the scale of the collapse. On the trading floor, the atmosphere was one of shock and awe, as if the world they had known was falling apart. "I don't blame them," said one trader. "There was nothing anyone could do." Panic had set in. As the markets continued to plummet, the phones rang incessantly. Waiters at restaurants, some of whom had clients in the finance world, were on the phones with worried customers. They were hearing the same thing from all corners of the world. Fear. How low will it go? They asked. The declines were broad-based, affecting every sector of the market. The technology industry, once a pillar of strength, was under massive pressure, with even the mighty Apple seeing its stock slide. But this was just the beginning. Trillions of dollars were wiped out in the stock market, while the global economy teetered on the edge of a complete collapse. Subprime mortgages in the US had tanked, triggering a financial tsunami that reverberated around the world. Governments scrambled to contain the crisis, while people everywhere were reining in their investments, cutting their losses, and hoping they could weather the storm. Amid this chaos, one man knew the end was coming for him. Bernie Madoff, the man who had built his reputation on a web of lies and deceit, could feel the walls closing in. He had been running a massive Ponzi scheme for years, pulling in billions of dollars from investors with promises of guaranteed returns that seemed too good to be true. And, of course, they were. But now the game was up. There would be no new money to pump into his account, and his clients were starting to demand their original investments back. The facade was about to crumble. Madoff had always been able to find ways to delay the inevitable, but this time it was different. The withdrawals from his fund were exceeding what he could cover, and the money was gone. His clients had trusted him with their savings, their futures, their dreams, and now Madoff knew he had nothing to give them in return. The Ponzi scheme that had made him a legend in the financial world was nearing its end. In an effort to stave off the inevitable, Madoff did what he could to secure more cash. He established a subsidiary in London, Madoff Securities International, but it was suspiciously empty of clients. The firm transferred around $150 million in November, and then, in December, a billionaire named Carl invested over $200 million. A few days later, Madoff received another $10 million investment. But these moves, as desperate as they were, weren't enough to keep the scheme afloat. Soon, Madoff began asking everyone for cash, anyone he could reach on Wall Street. In one last-ditch effort, he even distributed a 19-page booklet detailing his new investment scheme. But despite his best efforts, the withdrawals continued, and the investors' demands became impossible to meet. It was clear to everyone involved that Madoff had no more money to give. The bubble was about to burst, and the world would soon find out that the entire empire was built on sand. With the end fast approaching, Madoff decided to turn himself in. He didn't try to run or hide. He didn't have the energy left to do so. He knew it was over, and all he could do was face the consequences of his actions. The Ponzi scheme had collapsed, and $65 billion in investments had vanished into thin air. Thousands of investors, from ordinary families to the wealthiest individuals, had lost everything they had trusted him with. The fallout would be catastrophic. In the midst of this chaos, Madoff's sons, Mark and Andrew, were living in the dark. They had worked at their father's firm for years, but they had never suspected the magnitude of the fraud he was running. They were unaware that the very business they were working for had been a front for a massive criminal operation. One day, Bernie sat them down and dropped a bombshell. He was planning to give out nearly $200 million in bonuses to the staff, even though the firm was bleeding cash and the global financial meltdown was in full swing. Mark and Andrew immediately questioned their father's decision. It didn't make sense, especially given the circumstances. But Madoff insisted, and finally he confessed the truth. He told them about the Ponzi scheme he had been running and revealed that he was planning to turn himself in at the end of the week, after the bonuses were paid out. His sons were devastated. This was the first time they had ever heard about their father's criminal activities. Fearing they would be implicated in the fraud, they contacted a lawyer. In a moment of moral clarity, they chose to turn their father in, preventing him from distributing the bonuses. As the full scope of the scandal unfolded, the Madoff family was thrown into turmoil. Bernie was arrested at his home, then released on bail under house arrest. His world was falling apart, and he knew there was no turning back. But it was Christmas Eve, and for the Madoffs, it was the beginning of a long and painful reckoning. On that night, Bernie and Ruth Madoff, two childhood sweethearts who had once built their lives together, lay in bed consumed by the crushing weight of their downfall. In a desperate bid to escape their unbearable reality, they consumed a cocktail of prescription medications. The couple tried to end their own lives, unable to face the consequences of Bernie's actions. But when Christmas Day arrived, they awoke to find that their attempt had failed. They were still alive, but their world had been irreparably shattered. In the aftermath of the failed suicide attempt, Bernie Madoff didn't fight his charges. He admitted his guilt, expressed remorse, but offered no excuses. Over $50 billion in investments had been wiped out, affecting everyone from billionaire investors to the pension funds of everyday people. The economy was already in meltdown, and now the trust of thousands had been betrayed. Madoff pled guilty, and within months, he was sentenced to 150 years in prison. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, his name forever synonymous with the worst financial fraud in history. At the age of 81, he remains in a medium security prison in North Carolina, facing the consequences of his actions. But the story doesn't end there. In prison, both of Madoff's sons passed away. Andrew died from cancer, and Mark tragically took his own life. As for Ruth, she has distanced herself from Bernie, refusing to speak to him. The woman who once called him her soulmate has severed all ties. A painful but understandable decision given the unimaginable betrayal. Bernie Madoff is allowed one 15-minute phone call per day. But in his own words, "I have no one to talk to." His family is gone, his empire is gone, and the legacy he built is now a cautionary tale of greed, deception, and the devastating consequences of dishonesty. The story of Bernie Madoff teaches us many important lessons. It warns us about the dangers of placing blind trust in others, especially when something seems too good to be true. It reminds us that greed, no matter how cleverly disguised, will always lead to ruin. And it shows us that, no matter how much money you have or how successful you become, you cannot outrun the truth forever. Madoff's rise to fame and fortune was built on lies, and his downfall was inevitable. The real tragedy, however, lies in the countless innocent people whose lives were destroyed by his actions. These were not just numbers on a ledger. They were real people with real dreams, and Madoff stole from them all. The Madoff saga is a powerful reminder that shortcuts to success, whether through dishonesty, manipulation, or deceit, may offer temporary rewards, but they are ultimately hollow and fleeting. True success comes not from how much you accumulate, but from how you achieve it. Integrity, honesty, and hard work will always outshine deceit, no matter how tempting it may seem in the moment. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more captivating tales that explore the human side of history. Like this video if you believe lessons like these are crucial for today's world, and feel free to share your thoughts on the moral of the story in the comments below. What do you think Madoff's downfall teaches us? We'd love to hear from you.